backbencher Julian Lesser chose to use his maiden speech in Parliament to cast light on a topic that many Australians have had to endure. He spoke about his father's death by suicide 20 years ago in the hope that he can encourage others who are experiencing depression to seek help. I spoke with Julian Lesser in his electorate in Sydney this afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Hayden.
It seemed an extraordinarily brave move of you to speak so publicly about what must be a very deeply personal experience. What was that moment like for you?
I can only describe it as a bit of an out-of-body experience. The gallery was filled with over 400 people. I have such respect for the Parliament that to get up there for the first time and give a maiden speech in and of itself was always going to be an emotional experience, but obviously to talk about such a deeply personal issue and to relive some of those events of that night, as I suppose in many respects that's a scene that has never left my mind since that night, was obviously a difficult thing to do, but I felt it was important to put it on the public record, particularly to draw attention to the fact that there's people in the Parliament that understand what people who are bereaved by suicide or who are contemplating suicide feel.
20 years ago this month, my mother approached my room to wake me, but it was with a very different sound, pace and tempo. Seared on my mind from that night was the speed of her approach and her scream as she flung the door open of my bedroom sobbing, "Dad's gone, Dad's gone."
You spoke in your speech about that awfully traumatic moment when you woke up and heard the news that your father was gone. How do you live with that for the rest of your life?
Well, you try to do what you can to acknowledge the people around you and to make sure that you could do something so it doesn't happen to someone else. It was such an extraordinary moment. This scream of my mother's as she opened the door, the constant sobbing, going down the hall and finding his pyjamas in a pile, and then, you know, the banality of seeing this note of his, as you wrote so many notes, shopping lists, whatever it might have been, on the back of a used envelope in red pen saying, you know, "I'm sorry, Sylvia, I just can't cope, love, John." And then going to the garage, seeing the car was missing, and then when the police came, having called the police when they came round to tell us that they'd found his body at the bottom of the gap at Watson's Bay, it's a moment I'll never forget.
I can't imagine what it's like for any family member who has someone in their family die by suicide. And you touched on this when you said that every day since, pretty much, you've asked yourself, what could you have done? How do you deal with thoughts like that now?
Well, what I'm trying to do, and why I spoke, was to try and encourage people to notice the people around them. So to give you an example with my father, the week before he died, we were always a family that hugged each other, but he started to give us all these very long hugs. He was a great car parker and was very proud of being a great car parker, but he then just didn't seem to care how he parked the car the week before. He was obviously giving us a sign that something was wrong, but didn't say anything. And I think the most important thing that we can all do is notice the individuals around us. And if you think somebody might be contemplating taking their own life, it's very important that you ask them the very confronting question, are you contemplating suicide? Because the experts tell us if you ask somebody that direct question to a person who is actually contemplating suicide, they'll be relieved that somebody knows what they're thinking about, and you are more likely to get them to open up, and you're more likely to save a life. And that's what we've got to try and do.
Do you feel that we as a society do not talk about this issue enough?
I think we're certainly more open about it now than we were 20 years ago when my father died. I mean, my father was of a generation of men who didn't talk much about their feelings, and I think that's something that's changed in society.
And what was your father like?
He was a lovely man. He was very quiet, a very gentle man, easy listening music, and I described in the speech how the day he died, the music seemed to stop in our house because he'd turn on the radio station, listen to the music, and it would go off when he went to sleep. And he was a man who was very involved in his community. I mean, he sat on the board of our synagogue. He was very involved in our school activities. One of the great tragedies, I think, in relation to suicide is that people never really appreciate how much they will be missed by other people. There were hundreds and hundreds of people at his funeral.
And the number, that number that you mentioned in your speech of 8 people every day who die by suicide in Australia, that's a terrible figure.
It is a terrible figure, and it's the highest figure recorded on record. I mean, records in relation to suicide are not complete, and it's still quite underreported in a way. But since we've been gathering the figures, they keep climbing. I mean, I have, in this electorate, over the last 8 years, over 100 people have died by suicide.
And a lot of older people. We hear a lot about youth suicide,
Yes.
rightly, but also older people.
Older people, and particularly men. I mean, suicide is an issue that disproportionately affects men. 75% of people who take their own lives are men. And I think we need to have a greater focus on the isolation of middle-aged men and some of the stresses and pressures that they're under, trying to find what their role is in society, with the family responsibilities, with their work responsibilities, with where they are in the workforce at the particular time.
You are now a member of a government as well, though, and surely extra funding in early intervention in mental health care, for example, could help. Is that something you will be fighting for?
Well, I'm really proud that the Prime Minister and the Health Minister are so strongly committed to suicide prevention, and it's a personal issue for them too. The gap where my father took his life is in the Prime Minister's electorate. But I think money alone and treating suicide as a medical or a health issue alone isn't enough. We've actually got to focus on community building and making people stop, spend time and be aware of the people who are around them.
And how would your father feel about you this week?
Well, I hope that my election and the speech that I made would have brought a degree of joy to him, as I know it has done to my family, friends and so many other people.
I'm sure it would have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hayden.
And if that story has raised concerns for you, remember that help is available. You can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46.